A very good morning, everybody. For the today's session, I am discussing about the pharyngeal pouches. The last class I have discussed about the pharyngeal arches, and now for today I will discuss about the pharyngeal pouches. Okay. So all you know this pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal pouches, and pharyngeal cleft. All together we call the complex as the pharyngeal apparatus. Okay, and the inner lining of the pharyngeal arches, which is lined by the endoderm. Okay, between the two uh, arches, you see the pouch is present, which is lined by the endoderm. So this is the first pouch, second pouch, third pouch, and fourth pouch. The outer ectoderm lining, again you have between the two arches, you have the clefts, or it is also called as grooves. So we have the arches, clefts, and pouches. So in the last class, as I said, I have discussed about the arches. Now today I will discuss about the pharyngeal pouches. Okay, so the apparatus consists of the cleft, which is outer one. This is the arch. The innermost will be the pouches. So C for the cleft, A for the arches, and P for the pouches. So from outside to inside, you have CAP, cap, which you can remember as a mnemonics. So cleft, arches, and pouches. The pharyngeal pouches. So what are these pharyngeal pouches? These pharyngeal pouches, there are four pairs of pharyngeal pouches, and these are invaginations of the endoderm lining the interior to the primitive pharynx between the two arches. So if this is a pharyngeal apparatus, if you see here, now these are the arches. So the inner lining. So what did he say is that these are the invaginations of the endoderm. So the inner side of the primitive pharynx, it is lined by the endoderm, and these invaginations of endoderm lining the interior to the primitive pharynx between the two arches are called as the pharyngeal pouches. This one. See, this is one invagination. This is one invagination. This is one. So this endoderm, which is invagination in between the two arches, is forming the pouch. So this is the first pouch, this is the second pouch, this is the third pouch, this is the fourth pouch. So altogether we have four pairs of pouches on either sides in the primitive pharynx. The pharyngeal pouches are numbered in cranocordinal direction. So from the cranocordinal direction, they are numbered. Number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. Thus, the first pouch is between the first and second arch. So these are the arches. Okay. So between the first arch and second arch, you have the first pouch. Between the second and third, you have the second pouch. Between the third and fourth, you have the third pouch. And fourth and sixth, you have the fourth pouch. So likewise. So this is all you can see here. This one. This is the first pouch. This is the second pouch. This is the third pouch, and this is the fourth pouch. So all these are the pouches which are seen on the inner side of the primitive pharynx and lined by the endoderm. And this outer one, which is blue color represented, this is the ectodermal lining, and between the arches you see again this depression, which is called as the pharyngeal cleft, that I'll talk to you later. The first pharyngeal pouches. The first pharyngeal pouches. Now from each pharyngeal pouches, you get some derivatives. So what the derivatives, we go in detail about it. The first pharyngeal pouch elongates to form the diverticulum called tubotympanic recess. So I'm talking about this one. So this is the first pharyngeal pouch. The first pharyngeal pouch elongates to form a diverticulum called tubotympanic recess. The distal part of this recess expands while the proximal part remains tubular. If you see here, this is the distal part of this pouch. The distal part of this pouch is expanded while the proximal part is remaining the tube. So this is like tube, whereas this is elongated. The distal expanded part of tubotympanic recess comes in contact with first pharyngeal cleft. Yes, this is the first pharyngeal cleft, or this is the first pharyngeal groove. So outer, this is the ectodermal lining between the arches, first arch and second arch. This is called as pharyngeal groove or pharyngeal cleft. And between the inner side lined by the endoderm between the first and second arch, this is called as pharyngeal pouch. So the first pharyngeal pouch elongates to form a diverticulum called as tubotympanic recess. This is tubotympanic recess, and this tubotympanic recess, it is expanded distally and it is tubular proximally. Okay, and the next is that this distal expanded part of the tubotympanic recess, which comes in contact with the first pharyngeal groove. The distal expanded part of tubotympanic recess forms the middle ear cavity, or it is called as tympanic cavity. So this distal expanded part, which is coming closely in contact with the first pharyngeal groove, this part which is expanded, which forms the middle ear cavity, or it is also called as the tympanic cavity. And not only that, it also forms the mastoid antrum. The proximal tubular part, this one, the proximal tubular part, it forms the tubotympanic recess. It forms the proximal tubular part of tubotympanic recess forms the eustachian tube. This forms the eustachian tube, or it is also called as auditory tube or eustachian tube or pharyngotympanic tube, which forms a communication between the nasopharynx and the tympanic cavity or the middle ear cavity. So between the nasopharynx and the middle ear cavity, there is a communication established, and this communication is formed between this eustachian tube, or this is also called as auditory tube, or else you also call it as the pharyngotympanic tube. Coming to the second pharyngeal pouch, the second pharyngeal pouch, if you see here, this is the second pharyngeal pouch. Between the second and the third arches, you see this evagination of the endoderm on the inner aspect of the primitive pharynx. This is the second pharyngeal pouch. Now the endoderm of the second pouch proliferates to form number of tiny solid buds. So it proliferates a number of tiny solid buds that extends into the underlying mesoderm. The mesoderm condensed around these buds. The central core of these buds break down to form tonsillar clefts. Next, the endoderm of the second pharyngeal pouch forms a stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelium lining the tonsillar clefts on the pharyngeal surface of the tonsil. The mesoderm forms a lymphoid tissue, fibrous capsule, and the connective tissue elements of the tonsil. So the second pouch is mostly obliterated by developing palatine tonsil. So in the adults, the part of this pouch remains as the intratonsillar cleft, or it is also called as crypta magna. So the second pouch is giving rise to a lymphoid tissue, which is called as the the tonsil, palatine tonsil. Third pharyngeal arch, the third pharyngeal pouch. The third pharyngeal pouch expands and differentiates into the dorsal bulbar part and the ventral tubular part. So this is the third pouch, and this third pouch is divided into the the dorsal bulbar part and the ventral tubular part. The communication of the third pouch with the pharynx narrows down, and ultimately the pouch is cut off from the pharynx. The pouch is now lying in the mesoderm outside the pharynx. The endoderm of the dorsal bulbar part, this one. The endoderm of this dorsal bulbar part of the third pouch proliferates to form the inferior parathyroid gland. Inferior parathyroid gland. The endoderm of the ventral tubular part of the third pouch proliferates and give rise to thymus. So it's very simple. The third pharyngeal pouch, it has got a dorsal bulbar part and a ventral tubular part. The dorsal bulbar part will proliferate and it forms the inferior parathyroid gland, whereas the ventral tubular part, which will proliferate and gives rise to the thymus. See, again I repeat, the first pouch will give rise to the middle ear cavity, which is dorsal expanded part, and the ventral tubular part, which will give rise to the proximal tubular part, which will give rise to the what do you call the auditory tube or eustachian tube. The second pharyngeal pouch, it gives rise to a lymphoid tissue, which is called as the palatine tonsil. The third pouch will give rise to the parathyroid gland, inferior parathyroid gland, which is the dorsal bulbar part. And whereas the ventral tubular part, it proliferates to develop and gives rise to the thymus. See here, this one. This is the first pouch, which is forming the mastoid antrum and the tympanic cavity. And this is the communication which is established between the nasopharynx and the middle ear cavity. This is called as the eustachian tube or the auditory tube. The second pouch, this gives rise to the palatine tonsil. The third pouch, which gives rise to the inferior, see, this is the inferior parathyroid gland, and as well as you see a tubular part which is called as the thymus. Coming to the fourth pharyngeal pouch, the fourth pharyngeal pouch expands and differentiates into dorsal bulbar part and the ventral tubular part. Again, the fourth pouch is also expands and differentiate into the dorsal bulbar part and the ventral tubular part. The communication of the fourth pouch with the pharynx becomes narrow and soon disappears. The endoderm of the dorsal bulbar part of the fourth pouch proliferates to form the dorsal bulbar part. The dorsal bulbar part of the what do you call the fourth pouch, it proliferates to form the superior parathyroid gland. The inferior parathyroid gland is formed by the bulbar part of the third pouch, whereas the fourth pouch, the bulbar part of the fourth pouch, the endoderm of the dorsal bulbar part of the fourth pouch, it proliferates to form the superior parathyroid gland. So the parathyroid in the inferior parathyroid gland developing from the third pouch migrates downwards caudally along with the thymus. Hence, its position is lower than the superior parathyroid gland, which is developing from the fourth. So what he's telling is that inferior parathyroid gland, which is developing from the what do you call the third pouch, it migrates caudally along with the thymus. So the third pouch is giving rise to inferior parathyroid gland, and this inferior parathyroid gland, it migrates downwards along with the thymus. Note, for most importantly, one thing has to be noted: the fifth pouch, which is the ultimobronchial pouch, appears for a few very less time, where it appears for a very brief period, gets incorporated with the fourth pouch, and together the fourth and fifth pouches will together they form a complex which is called as the cardopharyngeal complex, caudal pharyngeal complex, caudal pharyngeal complex. The neural cleft cells that migrates into this complex forms the parafollicular or the C cells for the thyroid gland. So usually there is no fifth pouch, but the fifth pouch usually it appears for a very small duration of the time, and which will incorporate or which will join with the fourth pouch and forms together, they form a complex which is called as caudal pharyngeal complex. And the neural crest cells that migrates into this complex forms the parafollicular or the C cells for the thyroid gland. See here. So this is a complex which is called as the caudal-pharyngeal complex, which is a complex formed between the by the combination of the fourth and fifth pouches, and the neural cells from this ultimobronchial complex or the cardopharyngeal complex will proliferate and forms the C cells. The C cells are nothing but they are the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. So this is the overview of the derivatives of all the four pouches. The first pouch will give rise to the pharyngotympanic tube, or which is also called as eustachian tube or auditory tube, and it also gives rise to medullary cavity and mastodantrum. The second pouch, the palatine tonsil and intertonsillar clefts. The third pouch will give rise to the thymus gland as well as the inferior parathyroid glands. The fourth pouch will give the superior parathyroid gland and forms a complex with the fifth pouch for the short period of time, which is called as ultimopharyngeal body or complex. It is also called as caudal pharyngeal complex. Coming to the pharyngeal grooves. So this one. Now, till now we have discussed about this part, which is called as the pharyngeal pouches, which are the inner side, which is lined by the endoderm of the primitive pharynx. So the outer side of the primitive pharynx, it is lined by the ectoderm. Okay, so between the two arches you see a cleft again, the outer side, and this is called as pharyngeal clefts, or it is also called as pharyngeal groove. You can see here, this is pharyngeal cleft. The outer side lining by the ectoderm is called as pharyngeal cleft. The inner side, which is lined by the endoderm, which is called as pharyngeal pouch, which we have discussed already. So these pharyngeal clefts are 4 in number. Again, they are numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are the invaginations of the surface ectoderm between pharyngeal arches. So between the pharyngeal arches, there is an invagination of the ectoderm lining. And this is called as pharyngeal clefts or the pharyngeal grooves. So between the arches, this is our arches. So between the arches, you see an outer ectodermal lining invagination between the arches, which is called as pharyngeal cleft or pharyngeal grooves. In the region of pharyngeal membrane, the pharyngeal wall is very thin, but consists of 3 layers. From outside to inside, they are outside to inside. From inside to outside, they are. This is the endodermal lining, and this arch are lined by the mesoderm, and the outer one is called as the ectoderm. So endoderm, mesoderm, ectoderm. Okay. About these arches, if you see, about these clefts, if you see, only the first pharyngeal cleft gives rise to a definitive structure. Only the first pharyngeal cleft will give rise to a definitive structure, that is the external auditory meatus, whereas all other clefts, second, third, and fourth, are obliterated. Only the first cleft will give rise to a structure which is called as external auditory meatus, and rest of the second, third, and fourth clefts or grooves are obliterated. There is one structure which is called as cervical sinus. So what is this cervical sinus? The mesenchyme of the second pharyngeal arch, the mesenchyme of the second pharyngeal arch rapidly grows downwards and overlaps second, third, and fourth pharyngeal clefts and fuses with epicardial ridge Thus, the second, third, and fourth pharyngeal clefts are buried under the surface and forms a slit-like cavity called as cervical sinus that is lined by ectoderm. So here, the second pharyngeal arch, it rapidly grows downwards and overlaps the second, third, and fourth, the pharyngeal grooves. Okay. Thus, the second, third, and the fourth pharyngeal clefts are buried under the second, buried under the surface and forms a slit-like cavity called as cervical sinus, and this cervical sinus will soon disappears as the neck develops. See here, everybody. So this is the second arch, and as it is rapidly growing downwards, the second, third, and the fourth, all these clefts, the pharyngeal clefts are what happened? It grows downwards and it is joining with the epicardial ridge, and as it is growing rapidly downwards and joining with the, see here, the mesenchyme of second pharyngeal arch rapidly grows downwards and overlaps second, third, and fourth pharyngeal clefts or grooves and fuses with the epicardial ridge. So here, this second pharyngeal arch is growing downwards rapidly and it is overlapping the second, third, and fourth pouches, and finally it is fusing with the epicardial ridge. As it is fusing with epicardial ridge, you see like this. So the second, third, and fourth pharyngeal clefts or grooves are buried and it is forming a sinus. And this sinus is called as the cervical sinus. And this cervical sinus is also, it is disappeared soon as the neck is developed. Now coming to the clinical anatomy of the pharyngeal apparatus, the first is you need to know is the first arch syndromes. The first arch syndromes are, these are the syndromes occur due to the lack of migration of neural crest cells into the first pharyngeal arch. Clinically, they present with various facial anomalies called as first arch syndromes. The most important first arch syndromes are Treacher's-Collins syndrome, Pierre-Robin syndrome, D-George syndrome. Out of these three, the Treacher-Collins syndrome and the Pierre-Robin syndromes are very important, and I'll go with that. The Treacher-Collins syndrome is also called as mandibulofacial dystosis, and it is an inherited as an autosomal dominant trait that is caused by an autosomal dominant gene. Okay. Clinically, the Treacher-Collins syndrome presents the malar hypoplasia due to the underdevelopment of the zygomatic arch and the mandibular hypoplasia. And not only that, you also have the down slanting palpebral fissure. Down slanting palpebral fissure is also seen. That means the mandible is not developed. Zygomatic arch is not developed. Okay. So malar hypoplasia due to the underdevelopment of the zygomatic arch or zygomatic bones. Mandibular hypoplasia is seen. Mandible is not developed completely. And there is also a down slanting palpebral fissure is also seen. So in this picture, you can see very clearly the mandible is not developed. Mandible is not developed. And the down slanting palpebral fissure also you can see over here. Okay, malar hypoplasia is also seen here. Is it clear? Which is a Treacher-Collins syndrome. Is it clear? Next, we have the Pierre-Robin syndrome. It is an autosomal recessive disorder. Okay. Recessive disorder and occurs in approximately about 1 in 85,000 births. Okay. And this will have a presentations like macroganthia, which has got a small mandible, cleft palate is observed, glossoptosis, which is nothing but this is the posteriorly placed tongue. And out of all these three, the primary defect is a small mandible, which is macroganthia. If you observe here in this Treacher-Collins syndrome, here the mandible is not developed properly. And here also malar hypoplasia means the underdevelopment of the cheekbones. The cheekbones are not seen. The cheekbones are nothing but the zygomatic bones. So the malar hypoplasia is seen in Treacher-Collins syndrome. Mandibular hypoplasia is also undeveloped or poor development of mandible can be observed in Treacher-Collins syndrome. Whereas in the Pierce-Robin syndrome, macroganthia, the mandible is developed but is very smaller in size. Cleft palate is seen, and glossoptosis, where the tongue is placed posteriorly. Out of all these things, the primary defect is the small mandible. So this is all about the pharyngeal pouches, the pharyngeal cleft, and the clinical aspects related to the pharyngeal arches. That is the first arch syndrome. Hope you understood, and thank you so much.